I met a 30-ish-year-old woman I will call Sarah after presenting at the MAP Psychedelic Science Conference in California in 2017. Sometime later, Sarah told me about a panel she had attended at that conference on ayahuasca, where at the end a man came up on stage seeming very distressed, potentially psychotic. Sarah thought the panelists dealt with him well, calmly. For her part, she had a pebble in her pocket and went up to the man while he was on stage and gave it to him, saying, "You need this more than I do right now." After the man had calmed down, he came up to Sarah wanting to give her back the stone, and she told him to keep it, which he really liked and thanked her for. At that time, Sarah often carried pebbles around. After conversation with her therapist about how she likes to be in nature, she chose to start looking out for pebbles that were calling out to her as grounding talismans. This may be a familiar feeling story for many of us here, but Sarah is also a voice hearer who co-facilitates a Hearing Voices group where she and others share and make meaning out of their unusual experiences previously labeled as psychotic and schizophrenic. The reason I met Sarah had little to do with the content of my talk, but was because as a panelist, I had been introduced by Bia, actually, as having worked previously with the Hearing Voices Network, an international movement of voice hearers who reject the claim that voices are meaningless symptoms of brain disorders. Over time, some people in the Hearing Voices Network actually end up becoming friends with their once aggressive voices. This hasn't been the case for Sarah, whose relationship to her voices over the years has been strained at best. And yet, Sarah has found psychedelic experiences with mushrooms and MDMA to be really helpful. After one mushroom experience in which she saw herself die, she was no longer 100% terrified of the thought of death, which had until then been one of the biggest themes of her psychosis. This removed some of the power that her voices had had over her. Another time, she had what she describes as a mystical experience, not losing her voices as distinct phenomenal entities, but feeling completely connected to them and the world around her. With MDMA, every time her voices said something horrible, she exclaimed back that she didn't care. And then they would say something else, and she would again respond, "I don't care." She experienced them as having no power over her. To this day, every now and again, her voices will say, "I hate MDMA." I find Sarah's courage to explore these intersections of altered states and her intuitive grasp of what was to help the distressed man at the conference compelling. Not least because the current renaissance of clinical research into psychedelics warns against psychedelics being used by people who have had, or even whose family members have had, psychosis. At the next psychedelics conference I was at, the usual awkward silence came over a panel when an audience member asked about the potential usefulness of psychedelics in treating schizophrenics. It was as if the questioner had unknowingly crossed a line. Two panelists gestured towards psychedelics maybe being helpful with sufficient support in place, but the definitive response came from the MD and clinical trial researcher, who explained that psychedelics could worsen the condition of someone experiencing psychosis who is a danger to themselves or others. The audience member responded, "What about people who are not a danger to themselves or others, but who might, for example, have their best friend in their head?" With this, the researcher changed tack, explaining that pathology requires someone is non-functional, implying it would not apply to those individuals the audience member was asking after. The contradiction, saying both that psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia are contraindicated and an exclusion criterion of the clinical trials, evoking permanence, while maintaining that psychosis demands a loss of functionality in the moment, was audible in the uneasy silence. Ultimately, the language of risk, of relapse, of return smooths over the contradiction. The exclusion of people with personal or family histories of psychosis or major mental illness from trials works well for current medicalisation imperatives, but raises unanswered questions that go to the very origins of psychedelics research. In 1892, Emil Kraepelin, who coined dementia praecox, the forerunner to schizophrenia, first proposed to systematically use drugs to study elementary psychological functions through the production of artificial psychoses. Mayer Gross noted that by 1925, Kraepelin wrote an epilogue of sorts to this part of his work, saying the results were disappointing, but the broader project, which came to be known as experimental psychiatry, had taken hold. Following Werner Stoll's initial research study into LSD in the late 40s, Sandoz was sending out LSD to researchers with a letter suggesting two possible uses: as an experiential model of psychosis for mental health professionals, and to induce experimental psychoses that may yield insights into the biochemical causes of schizophrenia, including the possibility that LSD mimics an autotoxin in the body that produces so-called endogenous psychosis. What followed was a boon in the number of experimental psychiatry studies seeking to produce temporary psychosis with psychedelics. Experimental psychiatry was radical, offering to continue the legacy of a Kripalian project to learn about the biochemical, physiological, and psychological phenomena using drugs. The promise was thrilling. As Cholden, Kurland, and Savage commented by 1955, the experimental value of a drug which could produce a controlled schizophrenic state would be inestimable. It stimulates the imagination to conceive the creation of a model psychosis which can be studied psychodynamically, biochemically, and subjectively at once. Over the 1950s and 1960s, experimental psychiatry contributed a wealth of new theories of mental functioning, including neurotransmitter theories based on chemical similarities with psychedelics. Some researchers sought to match different psychedelics to subtypes of schizophrenia. An experimental system where psychedelics are used to produce psychosis was further stabilized when the newly discovered tranquilizer chlorpromazine, useful in removing some of the symptoms of psychosis, also seemed to reverse the effects of psychedelics. In the end, the realization that psychedelics produce tolerance posed difficulty for these autotoxin hypotheses, because they couldn't explain how equivalent endogenous toxins could produce changes in behavior and experience beyond a matter of days. Correspondingly, the chemical imbalance theories of mental illness focused not on too much or too little of certain chemicals, but an imbalance across the brain would come to supplant the autotoxin accounts. Meanwhile, claims which had at first garnered some controversy that psychedelics could be therapeutic agents gathered steam. Research teams emphasized how the experiences produced by psychedelics generated a lot of unconscious material that could be worked with, as well as the rich psychodynamic potential of patients having and sharing profound experiences with clinicians and therapists. In 1958, Eisner and Cohen summarized the effects of LSD on psychotherapy as being that 1, LSD lessens defensiveness, 2, there's a heightened capacity to relive early experiences with accompanying release of feelings, 3, therapist-patient relationships are enhanced, and 4, there's an increased appearance of unconscious material. Most investigators report that therapeutic benefit can occur through any one or more of these factors. At the same time, Eisner and Cohen, the Saskatchewan team, and others had by the late 1950s developed protocols that match much of what is currently considered best practice. Despite case study successes, often articulated in terms of abreaction, the release of repressed emotions, in the course of this first wave of research, many came to understand psychedelic therapy as contraindicated for schizophrenia and psychosis, arguing that they saw no to minimal improvement at best and the worsening of patients' conditions at worst. But the vast majority of the model psychosis research was conducted with chronically hospitalized patients with long-term diagnoses of schizophrenia. It ignored differences in what is now called set and setting, including the iatrogenic harms of medical treatment contributing to patients' chronicity, and how psychosis presents across a range of diagnostic categories. By the 1970s, the model psychosis theory had been rejected by most researchers. The unavoidability of questions of set and setting had radically shifted the onto-epistemology. Constellating poles for understanding psychedelic drug effects around drug effects on the one hand and the effects of set and setting on the other rendered the model psychosis theory wide open to interpretation. By revealing effects distinct from those found in the naturalistic occurrence of psychosis, the clinical administration of psychedelics challenged the idea of psychedelics as mimicking endogenous psychosis, but the impossibility of conducting clinical trials that replicated the conditions of the naturalistic onset of psychedelics could be interpreted to show all the ways in which the psychotomimetic effects of psychedelic drug administration were being mitigated, attenuated, and reshaped. In experimental psychiatry, the workaround has been to define psychedelics as producing model or experimental psychoses, and to leave open the question of how similar such model psychoses in fact are to endogenous psychoses. And Nick Langlitz's book is really good on this. Others have been reductive in an anti-pharmacological direction, claiming that set and setting shaped almost all of how the experience unfolds and its impact. This was the favored approach of Timothy Leary and R.D. Laing. Robert Mogar, a collaborator in the latter years of the Psychedelic Review, wrote, "The collective evidence strongly indicates that almost all adverse reactions to LSD are due to non-drug factors, namely inadequate preparation, negative expectancies, character deficits, and poorly managed sessions. However, the same reasoning can be applied to psychotic states. Although not drug-induced, some schizophrenic reactions may have adverse effects because of personal limitations or an uncongenial environment. There's nothing intrinsically pathological about ego loss, regardless of its determinants, genetic, biochemical, familial, or social." The emphasis on set and setting is deeply embedded in today's research. Warning that indiscriminate use may be risky, the carefully prepared clinical trials also screen out people considered at risk of psychosis. However, research more marginal to the mainstreaming drive to create psychedelic-assisted treatments for PTSD, depression, and so on, continue to investigate overlaps with psychosis. Hermle, Gazoulis May-Frank, and their teams have argued for substantial overlaps between psychedelic experiences and the incipient acute stages of endogenous psychosis, including in the subjectively pleasant experiences of the dimension of oceanic boundlessness. There's been work on attention and sensory motor gating, notably by Vollenweider and Geyer's labs. While less emphasized than their use in therapeutics, the use of psychedelics in research as models of psychosis has continued rather than been superseded. One approach, evident in the first wave and again to a greater extent today, is to decompose and particularize the objects of study to subsystems of psychosis, dimensions of it, or factors, something the scientific research of the aforementioned labs continues to attempt. These research projects entail treating models as imperfect replications, good enough when they're useful. But another way is to embrace a different model of medicine, closer to the older notion of the pharmacon, where cure and poison are more closely intertwined. In 2016, Robin Carhart-Harris's team attempted to explain how psychedelics can be acutely psychotomimetic, yet subsequently psychologically beneficial. Commenting that it is known that psychedelics promote learning through making cognition more flexible, at the same time as less focused, the authors propose that psychedelics increase the amount of entropy or disorder in the brain. Here, they are belief relaxants, cognitive lubricants, a shake of the snow globe. The authors suggest that in increasing entropy, psychedelics produce a state similar to psychosis, effectively a version of the model psychosis theory. This is offered as a reason why psychedelics should not be taken by people with personal or family histories of psychosis. How could it be helpful for people with high degrees of entropy to get yet more of it? Or in terms of psychedelics as meaning-making drugs, why might people experiencing a profusion of meaning need to make yet more meaning? Or again, in those whose awareness is already too non-specifically amplified, why amplify it more? The most influential configuration of ideas of poison and cure has been in Stan and Christina Groff's notion of spiritual emergency, conveying both crisis and opportunity for spiritual emergence. I think spiritual emergencies offer an answer to why one would want to increase entropy in states that are already high entropy, to complete the journey and not close it down too soon. As Stan Groff has said, I had significant success with several psychotic patients when I was working in Prague. I came to the conclusion that spontaneous episodes of non-ordinary states can be therapeutic if they are correctly understood and properly supported. In traditional clinical psychiatry, there are reports indicating that some of the very acute psychotic episodes actually are those that have the best results. In some instances, there could even be an improvement over the patient's pre-psychotic state. Whereas those psychoses that develop slowly and have fewer symptoms, which are not as dramatic or rich, have the worst prognosis. Our prior therapeutic effort attempted to slow these things down and stop them rather than accelerate them. When I became aware that this effort didn't work very well, we started using LSD to accelerate their progression instead. The idea was that people can get through and move beyond a psychotic episode, rather than continuing to attempt to suppress the symptoms, which drags out the episode. Spiritual emergencies and similar terms bridge between the use of psychedelics and a host of experiments that variously exist or existed in what Sacha de Bruhl has dubbed the mad underground, from asylums to therapeutic communities and the mad pride movement. In mainstream psychiatry today, such approaches are often dismissed for taking an overly romanticizing or naive stance towards serious mental illness. Meanwhile, in the mental health survivor movement, there is a wariness of claims as to the nature of psychosis, or what has been come to be labeled as schizophrenia. That is to say, whether all experiences understood as psychosis can be seen as journeying that needs to be seen through is once again a live question, but also a treacherous one. In the spiritual emergence communities, there are attempts to differentiate those who are having a spiritual emergency from those who are truly psychotic, or depending on one's framework, psychotic disorders with potential for positive growth from psychotic disorders without such potential. The V code introduced into the DSM-4 in 1994 of religious or spiritual problem was an attempted settlement advocated for under the rubric of cultural sensitivity, offering to cleave off some psychotic experiences as spiritual or religious problems. Ultimately, it has proven difficult to tell the difference, and for diagnosticians not very well versed in spirituality, the key criteria remain those of functioning and harm to oneself or others. Diagnostic jostling and differentiation is one way to go. Another way is to reappraise the model psychosis theory enough to be able to generate useful comparisons between the myriad ways we already work with psychosis and how we work with psychedelic states. In a cursory comparison of Aldous Huxley's mescaline experience as documented through The Doors of Perception and Louis Sass's account of the phenomenology of the onset of psychosis, Nelson and Sass describe how both involve a receding of the standard sense of engagement with common sense reality, as well as a loosening of the standard sign-referent relationship. They offer a hypothesis that if these phenomena are different manifestations of a more basic underlying phenomenon, then the repeated experience of psychedelics could tempt forth the other manifestation. But could it not be the exact opposite? That is, the taste could be prophylactic, offering a training ground for working with any potential future naturalistic onset of psychosis. Or even, in cases where the taste generates meaning, the psychedelic experience may enable a deeper exploration of pre-existing psychotic-like experiences, but in a safe, chosen container, so that they can be better worked with or even resolved. Where the rubber meets the road, there exists today a diffuse network of community-based and underground practices working with people who are negatively affected by their psychedelics use. These professionals operate in quite pragmatic ways. Julie Megler, a psychiatric nurse practitioner who works at Sage Integrative Health, explains that psychedelic work can bring up people's trauma histories, and in working through those traumas, psychotic symptoms can emerge, which makes distinguishing between psychosis and spiritual emergency especially tricky. Evoking to me the doxa of the Hearing Voices network that connected Sarah and me, Julie explains how one can change one's relationship with past traumas into allyship, shifting from it controlling you to creating relationships so that you can have some agency in relation to it. The trauma becomes your friend that you can build on, building a psychic community of allies. Such professionals sometimes judiciously prescribe low doses of antipsychotics in cases where people who have taken psychedelics are left in lingering states of panic to slow down the process just enough to help them land, as Julie says. She adds this to a toolbox already containing sleep, acupuncture, and a spate of integration practices. What then are some issues to consider in whether psychosis can be treated as a journey to be skillfully brought to fruition? First, Stan Groff cautions in an extension of the previous passage, quote, "I should mention that I would not give LSD to someone who is paranoid. I need to have the feeling that I have a good working relationship with that patient." We know much about the value of rapport and trust from psychedelic therapy and the role of the milieu in shaping paranoia. These are important themes upon which to connect practices of support, being with, and accompaniment in psychedelics use to analogous practices in relation to psychosis. Secondly, who is to say which delusions have the mythic themes that are often considered an inclusion criterion of spiritual emergency and which do not? The emergence of mythic themes is often co-produced in dialogue over time through experimentation. The same goes for the exclusion criterion of conceptual disorganization. What about experiences that are confusing but clarify through ongoing dialogue and relationships? To paraphrase Lang, is the problem more that the therapist is confused? For instance, in the approach known as open dialogue, psychosis is understood and treated as a relational phenomenon. Thirdly, in today's mental health recovery movement, there is a dominance of the hero's journey trope. Forcing that onto every journey can be stifling, even as or because it is unfalsifiable. What other genres of recovery or growth are being ignored? And what of the unrecuperated? Is the imperative to make meaning from psychedelic and psychotic experiences a new kind of tyranny of positivity? And finally, the role of the amount of care needed. Rather than talk about pathology, Julie prefers to attend to the level of support someone has. When I asked her about the awkward silences when people mention using psychedelics in cases of psychosis at psychedelics conferences, she replied, "I think the thing that feels most tense when these kinds of questions are asked is, what is the level of support the person has? Because there can be a DIY approach to psychedelics. A lot of times we feel that sadly, individuals that are exhibiting those kinds of symptoms don't have the resources that are required to hold them in the container in which they really should be held." Is this all the difference comes to how well resourced we are? It suggests that because of the different support structures, one person is having a spiritual emergency while another is psychotic. We are used to the provocation to understand extreme experiences by their fruits. This goes one step further, to know them by the scaffolds and infrastructures that promise to bring them to fruition. Long understood as in the shadows, the psychedelics community might now consider its own shadows. There's a marked discrepancy in privilege between those interested in psychedelic healing in Western contexts and those diagnosed with schizophrenia or suffering from psychosis. With spiritual crisis networks and spiritual crisis and integration groups actively engaging elements of mainstream psychology and psychiatry, we see the building of much more hybrid infrastructures for approaching distressing experiences. These are reasons to be optimistic. By 1985, the disillusioned psychedelics researcher Sidney Cohen suggested, quote, "LSD will always be an elitist drug when taken for the purposes of self-transcendence," end of quote. His criticism was aimed at those who claimed LSD for everybody. In his view, only those whose life experiences or spiritual training had prepared them for the psychedelic would learn from it. He celebrated the circumscribed use of LSD in research, especially into transcendent, what he referred to as unsane experiences. Today, by removing people experiencing psychosis from the research picture and normalizing the contraindication of psychedelics in people with family histories of psychosis, schizophrenia, or other major mental illnesses, spiritual emergence can be easily commodified alongside the commodification of psychedelics, new products for those who can afford it. Yet it is precisely in teaching us how to hold and grow with distressing altered states, in research into states labeled as psychotic and schizophrenic, and in empathizing better with madness rather than relegating it to the categorically other, that we may see the greatest contribution of the psychedelic renaissance. Thanks.